Property activists and homeless people tried to hand Premier Mike Harris an eviction notice today. The group, the Toronto Action for Social Change, says the Harris Tories have attacked the most vulnerable in Ontario society by slashing welfare rates and subsidized housing.
They have lied about the need to cut the deficit at the expense of people who live in poverty, at the expense of women, at the expense of people of color, at the expense of lesbians and gays, at the expense of First Nations people.
Premier Harris was unavailable for comment. He was out golfing today for charity.
And handing over an eviction notice to the Premier's office. Did it work? Well, no. What it did do, though, was draw attention to the plight of the homeless. Marcy Ian has the story.
They marched quietly. No intended riots, only a handful of people.
Group size doesn't mean too much. It's an even smaller group running Ontario.
They have impaired the safety of numerous people in this province, people on public assistance, people needing health care, people needing education, battered women attempting to leave their husbands.
The group says the eviction notice is based on the Landlord and Tenant Act and charges that the Harris government has been a bad tenant by implementing policies that have been destructive to the premises being the province of Ontario.
Total farce.
A province, the group says, that is gripped by unprecedented levels of hunger and homelessness.
My family is one of the many that were cut off of welfare. We're fortunate that we actually live in a housing co-op with rent subsidy, otherwise we would have been homeless, and it would have been Mike Harris's fault.
Mr. Harris isn't here today. He's playing golf. What do you intend on doing?
Then we'll sit until designated cabinet minister, till Mr. Johnson comes. If they won't let us in. If they'll let us in, we'll serve the forms on his office.
If you'd like, we can take one of you up and you can deliver it yourself. If not, then there's nobody available to come down.
We're acting as a collective.
Okay. So you're welcome to stay out here if you want.
So they sat on the steps of the legislature in silent protest. 30 minutes later, security allowed 2 protesters to take their cause inside Queen's Park.
We're here to serve Mr. Harris onto you with this People's Eviction Notice, which is a legal Form 5, and what we'd like you to do is receive it.
The Premier's office received the eviction, but protesters say what happens next is up to Mike Harris.
Bring back employment equity, bring back the labor laws, take a look at how people voted in various places around the issues of city amalgamations, and answering to the people.
Marcy Ian, News on TV, Queen's Park.
Eyebrow.
We need them.
Well, here's Randy Steele now with the answer.
It's 9 o'clock Wednesday morning, and Caroline Liffman is on a mission. The McMaster University student is a driving force behind a nonprofit campaign to truly reduce, reuse, and recycle.
I've been working on this project for 30 hours a week for approximately 2 weeks now, and had decided before then that it was a really worthwhile project. We want to get this project off the ground and get it going. We just need a place to start.
And that has proved to be the most difficult part of getting the operation off the ground. Organizers need a free, accessible place. The United Way has offered the group a spot in an old warehouse, but the location is hidden in Hamilton's industrial heartland. Close to 25 volunteers have jumped on board, so the sooner Recycle Cycles can open for business, the better.
This is a tangible way and a grassroots way for the community to get bicycles out on the streets and to people who need them.
So what we're looking at is having bikes being donated and then fixing them up, buying new parts if we need to, and having parts donated and stuff like that. Selling them back at a really low cost, basically to recover the cost of the parts.
Parts that will be kept out of this spot, the municipal landfill, where thousands of bikes eventually find their way.
If we can keep it out of our landfills, if we can recycle before we actually recycle to the steel mills, that's a better idea too.
It's a simple, clean piece of technology, the bicycle, and it's a solution.
A solution that will begin as soon as the enthusiastic volunteers solve the problem of finding a place to hang their wrenches. Randy Steele, News on TV, Hamilton.
It's Buy Nothing Day in Hamilton. Santa's elves have escaped their North Pole sweatshop and started a rally outside Jackson Square today. They call themselves the Selfish Elves, and they would like consumers to refrain buying any goods today. The leader of the organization explains what they hope to accomplish.
And we want to spread the word about the holiday that's an unofficial holiday, but it allows people to take the day off from shopping one day a year and think about the mass consumption and the effect it has on the planet, on people's lives, and how many billions are spent by advertisers to entice people to spend their money on basically a lot of times unnecessary and really detrimental goods.
Well, Matt joins us now. Matt and I are pretty much the same. We have one present to buy a year. Have you bought yours yet?
With mostly praise for his recent budget, which eased the financial burden on post-secondary students. And he derided those who would simply spend to create jobs.
If we invest in those things of the industries of the future, then your generation are going to have jobs. But if what you're saying is engage in a lot of short-term fixes, quick fixes, I'll tell you, we're not going to do it. It didn't work, hasn't worked for the last 30 years. We're going to build a country. We're not seeking some kind of short-term goodwill.
But how about Tory leader Jean Charest's beef that extra money for students just means more will migrate to higher-paying and lower-tax jobs in the U.S.?
The problem with the Conservatives making that argument is, in fact, that the high taxes that we now have are a legacy of 10 years of Conservative government. We've started to turn that around. This is the first major tax reduction that Canada's seen in over a decade, and we're going to continue bringing those taxes down.
Martin was asked by one student if the public dislikes banks, why Martin himself is so popular. And on the deficit, how's this for a catchy political slogan? Quote, "The vicious cycle is now a virtuous circuit." You'll never make PM with that sort of stuff, Paul.
When I asked Paul Martin about the chances of Jean Charest becoming Quebec Liberal leader, Martin said, well, he was just one of the rank and file in the Quebec Liberal Party and he'd have no influence. Oh, yeah?
Foreign policy debate at McMaster University in Hamilton. About 20 students protesting continued sanctions against Iraq monopolized a question and answer session. ONTv's Randy Steele has the details.
The day started under friendly fire. As Federal Finance Minister Paul Martin was squeezing hands with young Liberals, down the hall, a waiting crowd of students was ready to lob a few grenades.
Answer my question, please. Answer my question. Can you answer the second question, please? I've answered your question 3 times.
Canada's policy towards Iraq prompted a handful of hecklers to harass the minister, but issues closer to home are also worrying students, namely the future.
We talked about building our future, and yet in my age group, Mr. Martin, the unemployment levels are, like, by most statistics, just about twice that of the national average.
Tory leader Jean Charest has been driving that point home this week during his cross-Canada tour, knocking the budget.
Once we have helped them pay for their education, they actually vote with their feet and walk to the United States.
Well, it's simply not true. By having put so much money back into research and development, in fact, we're making sure that they stay here because this is where the opportunities are going to be.
That's the key, Martin says, to sparking the economy, paving the way for students' futures. That and a strong Quebec, which brings Martin back to the unavoidable topic of Jean Charest and the vacated top Liberal job.
Oh, I think that he would be a very good candidate for the leadership. They're going to have a convention.
That campaign will undoubtedly feel the presence and influence of a powerful Paul Martin.
What are you going to advise the party to do?
Oh, well, I'm simply an ordinary member of the provincial party. I will go and play the role of an ordinary member.
We'll find out just how ordinary as the leadership plot thickens over the next few weeks. Randy Steele, News on TV, Hamilton.
Was at McMaster University to meet with students, and he was greeted with mostly praise for the budget measures that ease the burden on them. And he derided those who would simply spend to create jobs.
If we invest in those things of the industries of the future, then your generation are going to have jobs. But if what you're saying is engage in a lot of short-term fixes, quick fixes, I'll tell you, we're not going to do it. It didn't work, hasn't worked for the last 30 years. We're going to build a country. We're not seeking some kind of short-term goodwill.
And there's not a lot that we can do. We are going to be more aggressive in fighting crime than we have been in the past, and we're going to give our police officers more powers and more tools to deal with these problems.
The Premier will campaign in Stony Creek and Hamilton tomorrow before moving on to Niagara Falls. Ian Dovey, ONTv News, Hamilton.
Bill Good.
Good evening.
Canada's National Defence Headquarters was under siege for several hours this morning as more than 100 demonstrators surrounded the building to protest homelessness. As Mike Murphy reports, police made more than 50 arrests.
It looked like a throwback to the 60s. Protesters chanting anti-war songs.
Will you please let me through? Step back.
And standing nose to nose with cops in riot gear.
We are here to turn the War Department into the Housing Department.
More than 100 demonstrators blocked traffic over a busy Ottawa bridge during the morning rush hour. Their target, the National Defence Headquarters. They say the money being poured into military missions overseas should be used instead to fight homelessness.
The United Nations has declared us, Canada, a shame, an absolute shame for the amount of homelessness we have for supposedly a top-notch nation.
We've seen people on our streets in Burlington and close to us in Toronto, and they're actually dying. So there's a great need for new homes and all the supports to go with it.
We're asking you to open the street and disperse.
Police allowed the protesters to make their point for more than 2 hours. Then they moved in and hauled them off to a paddy wagon. Some gently, others not so gently. The government has appointed a minister to come up with a policy on homelessness. Some reports indicate that Claudette Bradshaw is prepared to spend up to $200 million more on housing. But these people don't believe it.
You've got the mayors of 10 major cities saying the #1 crisis is homelessness. Not one red cent has been put into the budget to alleviate homelessness.
By the time the demonstration was over, more than 50 people were arrested. Most were released quickly so they could catch a ride back home.
The Prime Minister says homelessness is being worked on, but he says today's protests in Ottawa show the government can't please everybody. Jean Chrétien says his government will increase spending in social areas now that it has a budget surplus. Chrétien spoke in South Africa, where he is attending the Commonwealth Conference. Canada's fine
shelter and the bird magazine.
The National with Ben Chin.
Good evening. New information tonight about the crash of Egypt Air Flight 990. Ottawa, or rather homelessness was. More than 50 of the protesters were arrested after going to the Department of National Defence to demonstrate against the amount of money Canada spends on the military. They think more money should go toward building homes for people who have none. Here's Julie Van Dusen.
Protesters draped their banner in front of the Defense Department, wrote slogans on the walls. The police braced for action.
A group of demonstrators have blocked this bridge to demand housing.
They set up a makeshift living room and settled in, blocking access to what is usually a very busy road. Their point? The cost of bombing the Balkans could have paid for 12,000 desperately needed affordable housing units.
It's a crisis. It's all across the country. Every night in Toronto, over 1,000 children sleep in shelters. And yet we walk around the world and we say we're peacekeepers and we're such a compassionate society.
The defense minister disagrees that military spending is too high.
By the same token, I think we need to do as much as we possibly can to help the homeless. I don't think these two objectives are mutually exclusive.
Social activists say there are up to 200,000 Canadians living on the streets. Just a few steps away from Parliament Hill, these two homeless men live one day at a time. And where are you going to sleep tonight?
Oh, maybe outside. I don't know.
Activists say Canada's homeless are a very visible symbol of a tattered social safety net.
What really concerns us are the households, the hundreds of thousands of households who are just hanging on, who are just barely able from month to month to keep their housing. And these are the people who are going to be swept onto the streets.
9 years ago, as opposition housing critic, Paul Martin helped write a report criticizing the Mulroney Tories for cuts to social housing. But then, once in power, the Liberals gutted funding for new social housing and turned the responsibility over to the provinces.
For Paul Martin to be the champion of housing in 1990 and then the exterminator of housing in 1993, to me is just an outrage.
Sources say the government will soon commit more money to tackle homelessness. The protesters doubt it will be anywhere near the $2 billion they say is needed now for new housing to ease the crisis.
Julie Van Dusen, CBC News, Ottawa.
There was Hundreds of demonstrators for the homeless shut down the street in front of the Defense Department headquarters. Some of them tried to muscle their way into the front door, but a police riot squad blocked them. More than 50 people were arrested. Protesters condemn millions Canada spent on bombs and troops in Kosovo, which they say could have created enough affordable housing to solve the crisis in homelessness. For very different reasons, the Canadian government has also decided it can't afford Kosovo.
Go, Pauline.
Only months after turning an overstretched army upside down to play with the NATO...
Nothing at all when the situation is better than we can withdraw people. And we're not the only one. Other countries are doing the same.
Bridge over the Rideau Canal for several hours. Police in riot gear moved in when the demonstrators refused to leave. They were demanding that millions of dollars spent on the armed forces should instead be used to build housing for the homeless.
Complex. More than 50 anti-poverty protesters were trussed up and tossed into paddy wagons. The cops moved in after some 150 demonstrators cut off access to Defense HQ for hours.
Idea.
They want millions of dollars diverted from military spending to housing the homeless. Millions of development dollars.
On TV News at 11.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dan McLean. Tonight, organizers zip. The World Trade Organization finds itself swamped in the Battle of Seattle. Faceless men in expensive suits in the Battle of Seattle this morning. It was a protest that has worldwide implications. The World Trade Organization was virtually swamped by the wave of protest that roared over the top of its first international conference.
Chaos in the streets of Seattle. Police using tear gas and pepper fog to disperse thousands of demonstrators. The protesters trying to shut down the World Trade Summit. This delegate clashing with demonstrators trying to block his path.
We're just normal people who are tired of the exploitation of multinational corporations throughout the world.
Among the 54,000 demonstrators, an odd collection of activists with all sorts of causes. From those opposing China's entry into the World Trade Group because of its human rights record in Tibet, to others trying to save sea turtles from fishermen. All out early this morning, blocking key intersections around the Seattle Convention Center and the hotels where delegates are staying. By mid-morning, the opening of the Trade Summit was delayed. The central part of Seattle shut down. Demonstrators on one side, police in riot gear on the other. Police repeatedly order the demonstrators to disperse. If you refuse to move, you will be subject to arrest. And when they don't move, officers lob pepper gas shells. While most demonstrators vow to keep their protests peaceful, a few break downtown store windows. For Seattle's workers and shoppers, a nightmare.
I want to be out of the middle of it. I'm scared to death. I just want to get to work. I want my kids out of the car. I don't want to be in the middle of this.
By mid-afternoon, marchers from labor unions protesting the loss of American jobs to underdeveloped countries take to the streets. Their march strictly peaceful. And as a gesture of solidarity, dock workers closed down freight shipments at ports up and down the West Coast. Finally, this afternoon, the Trade Summit gets underway 5 hours late. The demonstrations still going on in the streets, and more promised tomorrow when President Clinton arrives. George Lewis, NBC News, Seattle.
FBI.
Tony Parsons.
Good evening. They were ready for the worst and prepared to prevent it. Seattle police arrested hundreds of protesters to avoid a repeat of yesterday's melee when thousands of protesters shut down the opening ceremonies of the World Trade Organization. Downtown Seattle looked like a war zone with windows smashed, dumpsters set on fire, and riot squads shooting tear gas and pepper spray into the crowd. A state of emergency was declared and an overnight curfew placed in the area. But looting continued into the night. Leanne Gregg now with the latest from Seattle.
You're hurting me! Andy. Bound in plastic handcuffs and herded into city buses, protesters are getting the message today. Seattle police won't tolerate more violence. There ain't no power in the people's power, the people's power themselves. By afternoon, hundreds of demonstrators had been arrested, more than 3 times as many as yesterday. Those who protested peacefully blamed the riots on a small minority and spent the day trying to make amends.
But we also feel that we have a duty as nonviolent protesters to show the people that we didn't do this, but we think this is wrong, and we want to clean it up.
Taking no chances, police cordoned off a 50-block zone around the convention center where the World Trade Organization is meeting. National Guard troops, in some cases, outnumber protesters 10 to 1. Authorities now admit they seriously underestimated the potential for violence when 40,000 protesters poured into downtown, determined to stop the trade summit. Police used tear gas and rubber pellets when the demonstrations turned violent. Vandals set fires and looted businesses. The governor declared a state of civil emergency. Security was tightened today, becoming even more critical with President Clinton in Seattle to address the trade ministers.
We have great respect for a tradition of protest and demonstration in this country. What we do not respect and what we will not tolerate is vandalism, destruction of property, and threats to the physical safety of human beings.
It's an old saying that hit home today for a Canadian radio reporter who suddenly found himself as part of the story. Ted Field was in the middle of a live report to a Vancouver radio station when he was arrested along with scores of protesters.
What happened to you? What happened? I was in the wrong place. I was in the protesters were. I was behind on CKW, and I was just arrested. The co-mayor behind me was there trying to do a live report, and I didn't get a warning, and he just walked forward from where I was trying to do a report, and I was arrested. So I don't know where I'm going, but you were right in the middle of a live report. Yeah, I was giving a live report, and they moved forward, and they just took everybody.
WTO meetings did go ahead today, and in Seattle, American President Bill Clinton condemned the actions of violent protesters who blocked access to the conference and created havoc in the city's downtown. At the same time, Clinton acknowledged other demonstrators were acting in the best American tradition, and their views deserve to be taken into consideration by the World Trade Organization. Being a good...
President Bill Clinton in town to address the WTO delegates. Police in Seattle took no chances. Field was one of more than 400 arrested today, as groups ranging from Big Labor to the Ruckus Society continue to protest the World Trade Organization meeting.
Mass arrests today in Seattle. Police hauling away 250 protesters by noontime. Most charged with nonviolent offenses, such as blocking streets.
You don't touch me, that thing. Not
Police use buses to transport prisoners to a nearby Navy brig, which rapidly fills up.
God bless America.
In downtown Seattle, shopkeepers board up their windows after yesterday's rampage of destruction and looting. National Guardsmen join police in patrolling the streets of the downtown area. Groups of protesters clean up the graffiti sprayed during the clashes with police. And some worry that the message of their protest is getting drowned out by the acts of violence.
There are a few vandals in a crowd of tens upon tens of thousands of peaceful protesters from all those different constituencies and communities.
Who are the protesters and what are they doing here? They're people who feel that the World Trade Organization promotes the interests of big multinational corporations at the expense of workers, consumers, and environmental regulations.
The World Trade Organization overturns those laws without public accountability.
It's an odd assortment of groups with various causes, from the environment to labor unions to senior citizens organizations, all out in the streets of Seattle. Animal rights activists worried that the international fishing industry is killing off sea turtles and other endangered species. Labor union leaders who charge the trade group is exporting American jobs to sweatshops in underdeveloped countries.
I've never seen steel workers and tree huggers right next to each other. This isn't a bunch of loser hippies on welfare, druggies that are out here protesting. These are working people that are trying to keep jobs and feed their families.
The World Trade Organization meetings here continue through Friday, and so will the protests. Officials say they'll keep the state of emergency and overnight curfew in effect to prevent more violence. George Lewis, NBC News, Seattle.
And construction cutbacks. Rioting broke out when police attempted to block the protesters' route. The group was also angry over a controversial re-election bid by President Alberto Fujimori, who passed a law allowing a third term in office, then fired 3 federal judges who attempted to overturn the law. Mexican and